The goblet tipped, and red wine splashed across Elinor Vance's pale blue gown before she even understood what was happening. Gasps rose around her, followed almost instantly by laughter, sharp and cutting, the kind that told her this had not been an accident at all. She looked down at the dark stain spreading across the silk like a wound, and her whole body went cold. "Oh dear," said Lady Camilla Whitmore, her voice dripping with false concern. "How clumsy of me." The women around Camilla did not even try to hide their smiles. Elinor felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward her. The music seemed to grow louder, or perhaps it was simply the pounding of her own heart. She pressed a gloved hand against the stain as if she could somehow make it disappear, but the wine only spread further, soaking into the fabric she had spent weeks saving to afford. She was not born into wealth. Her father had been a respected but modest gentleman, and after his passing, Elinor had learned to make do with less while still trying to hold her place among people who never let her forget she did not quite belong. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, she had hoped just for a few hours to feel like she belonged somewhere. Instead, she stood in the middle of the grandest ballroom in the county, ruined and humiliated, while dozens of strangers watched and whispered behind painted fans. "Perhaps you should retire early," Camilla said, tilting her head with mock sympathy, "before you embarrass yourself further." Elinor's throat tightened. She wanted to say something clever, something sharp enough to wipe the smugness from Camilla's face, but no words came. All she could think about was the door and how quickly she could reach it without breaking into a run. She turned to leave, gathering what little dignity she had left, when a voice stopped her cold. "Miss Vance." The voice was deep, calm, and carried an authority that silenced the room almost instantly. Elinor froze. She knew that voice. Everyone knew that voice. Duke Julian Ashworth was crossing the ballroom floor directly toward her, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for a ship's bow. He was, without question, the most sought-after man in the entire province, wealthy beyond measure, unmarried, and famously private. Mothers had spent years trying to secure his attention for their daughters. He had granted none of them so much as a second dance. And yet here he was, walking straight toward the one woman in the room everyone had just finished mocking. Elinor felt her stomach drop. Surely he was coming to say something about the disruption, to ask that the stained, humiliated girl be quietly removed so the evening could continue undisturbed. She braced herself for one final blow to an already unbearable night. Instead, the Duke stopped in front of her, studied her face for a long moment, and then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, removed his own dark coat and held it out to her. "The room grows cold this time of night," he said simply. "Please take this." Elinor stared at him, certain she had misheard. Around them, the whispers had turned into stunned silence. "Your Grace, Elinor," he said her name gently, as though they had known each other far longer than the few brief exchanges they'd shared at prior gatherings. "Would you do me the honor of remaining as my guest for the rest of the evening?" For a moment she could not breathe. Behind the Duke, Camilla's face had drained of all color, her earlier smugness replaced by something closer to panic. The other young women who had laughed only moments ago now stood frozen, unsure whether to look away or keep staring. Elinor searched the Duke's expression for some sign of pity, some hint that this was simply an act of charity toward a girl who had been publicly humiliated. But she found none. His gray eyes held something else entirely, something steady, deliberate, almost as if this moment had been waiting to happen for a long time. Why, the question slipped out before she could stop it, quiet enough that only he could hear. A faint, knowing smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That," he said, "is a conversation for later. Tonight, allow me simply to make certain no one dares to laugh at you again." He extended his arm. For a heartbeat, Elinor hesitated, painfully aware of the wine-stained gown, of the eyes still watching, of everything that could go wrong if she accepted. But something in his steady gaze made the fear feel smaller than it had a moment ago. She placed her gloved hand on his arm. The room seemed to hold its breath as the Duke of Ashworth led her, wine stain and all, toward the head of the ballroom, the place reserved for only the most honored guests. Whispers erupted the moment they passed, urgent and disbelieving, but Elinor barely heard them. She was too aware of the warmth radiating from the Duke's coat now draped over her shoulders, too aware of the strange, quiet confidence that had settled over her the instant he'd spoken her name. Camilla watched them go, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her carefully constructed plan to humiliate Elinor collapsing before her eyes. Elinor did not look back. For the first time all evening she held her head high. As they reached the raised platform near the musicians, the Duke gestured for a servant to bring 2 glasses of untainted wine, then turned to face her fully, ignoring the dozens of eyes still fixed upon them. "You handled that with more grace than most would have," he said quietly. "I have watched you long enough to know that about you." Elinor blinked. "You have watched me." Something flickered behind his eyes, an admission he had not quite intended to make so soon. "Longer than you realize," he said, "but this is not the place for that conversation. Tonight simply allow yourself to enjoy the evening. No one here will trouble you again, I will make certain of it." She wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to understand why a man of his standing would risk his own reputation to defend a woman society had already dismissed. But the orchestra began a new piece, and the Duke extended his hand toward her, an unmistakable invitation. "Dance with me," he said. "Let them see exactly how little their opinions matter." Elinor's heart pounded as she placed her hand in his. The stain on her gown no longer felt like a mark of shame. Standing beside him, it felt almost like armor, proof that she had survived the worst the evening could throw at her, and had come out the other side standing taller than before. As they moved together across the floor, the whispers around them grew louder, but neither of them seemed to notice. Elinor caught glimpses of stunned faces, of Camilla standing rigid near the wall, her carefully built world quietly unraveling. None of it seemed to matter now. The Duke's hand rested steady at her waist, his gaze fixed on hers with an intensity that made her forget, for the briefest moment, that they were surrounded by hundreds of curious onlookers. There was something in the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with the polite detachment of a man performing an act of charity, but with quiet certainty, as though this dance, this moment, had been inevitable all along. "You seem troubled," he said softly as they turned in step with the music. "I am trying to understand why you did this," Elinor admitted. "Men in your position do not risk scandal for women like me." "Women like you," he repeated, a faint edge of amusement in his voice. "Tell me, Miss Vance, what exactly do you believe that means?" She hesitated. "A woman without fortune, without title, without anything to offer beyond her name, which itself carries little weight in rooms such as this one." The Duke's expression shifted, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You are mistaken," he said, "though I understand why you would believe it. Society has spent your entire life convincing you that your worth is measured in inheritance and connections. I assure you that is not how I measure it." Before Elinor could respond, the music slowed, drawing their dance toward its natural end. The Duke did not release her hand immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "There is a great deal I wish to tell you," he said, "but not here and not tonight, with half the room straining to catch every word between us. Will you permit me to call upon you properly, soon?" Elinor's pulse quickened. Everything about this evening had unfolded like something from a story she would never have dared imagine for herself. Humiliation transformed, in the space of a single dance, into something she could not yet name. "Yes," she said finally. "I would like that." The faintest smile crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. "Then it is settled." As the dance ended and he escorted her from the floor, Elinor felt the weight of dozens of stares following her every step, no longer filled with mockery, but with something closer to disbelief, curiosity, and, in more than a few cases, barely concealed jealousy. Camilla intercepted them near the edge of the room, her composure only partially restored. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully measured, "I do hope Miss Vance's gown was not too badly damaged. Such an unfortunate accident." The Duke regarded her with a coolness that made even Elinor shiver slightly. "Accidents," he said, "rarely require an audience of onlookers positioned so precisely to witness them, Lady Camilla. I trust you will take greater care in the future." Camilla's face paled further, and she offered no response as the Duke gently guided Elinor past her, toward the terrace doors that led out into the cool night air. Once they stepped outside, away from the noise and the watching eyes, Elinor finally allowed herself to exhale. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did in there. I do not know what I would have done if you had not intervened." "You would have survived it," the Duke said, studying her with quiet admiration. "You have a strength in you that most in that ballroom will never possess, no matter how much wealth or title they hold. I saw it the very first time we were introduced, months ago, though I doubt you remember the occasion." Elinor frowned slightly, searching her memory. "I am afraid I do not." "It matters little. What matters is that I have not forgotten it since." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the garden beyond the terrace, moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face. "There is far more to explain, Miss Vance, than I can offer tonight. But I promise you everything that happened this evening, the wine, the laughter, even my own intervention, none of it was as spontaneous as it appeared." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down Elinor's spine. "What do you mean?" The Duke turned to face her fully, his expression suddenly serious, weighted with something she could not quite decipher. "I mean," he said slowly, "that long before tonight I had already made a decision regarding you, Miss Vance. One that will likely surprise you a great deal once I find the courage to explain it properly." Before Elinor could press him further, a servant appeared at the terrace doors, informing the Duke that his presence was urgently required inside. He excused himself with a lingering glance that promised the conversation was far from finished, leaving Elinor standing alone beneath the moonlight, her wine-stained gown forgotten, her mind spinning with questions that would not let her rest. Whatever the Duke intended to tell her, she understood now that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine, and that the humiliation she had suffered at the start of the evening was only the very beginning of a much larger story unfolding around her. Word of the Duke's attention spread through the county faster than the wine had spread across Elinor's gown. By the time the sun rose the following morning, there was not a household of consequence that had not already heard some version of the story, each one more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed the Duke had declared his intentions to marry Elinor on the spot. Others insisted she had orchestrated the entire scene herself, staining her own gown to draw his attention. The truth, as always, mattered far less than the gossip. Elinor sat in the modest sitting room of her aunt's house, staring at the folded note that had arrived that morning, sealed with the unmistakable crest of House Ashworth. Her aunt, Margaret Whitfield, hovered nearby, wringing her hands with a mixture of excitement and disbelief that had not faded since Elinor returned home the previous night with the story spilling out of her in disjointed, breathless fragments. "Well," Margaret said for perhaps the 10th time that morning, "open it, child. Standing there staring will not tell you what it says." Elinor broke the seal carefully, unfolding the thick paper to find the Duke's handwriting, precise and elegant, requesting permission to call upon her that very afternoon. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words a second time, searching for any hidden meaning she might have missed. "He wishes to call today," she said quietly. Margaret's eyes widened. "Today, Elinor, we must prepare at once. The house is nowhere near presentable for a visit from a Duke." "Aunt Margaret, please, it is only a visit." "Only a visit," Margaret repeated, already bustling toward the kitchen to instruct the small household staff. "Child, do you understand what happened last night? The Duke of Ashworth, a man who has refused every eligible woman in this province for the better part of a decade, gave you his own coat in front of the entire assembly. That is not simply a visit." Elinor did not respond, though privately she knew her aunt was right. She had spent most of the night replaying the Duke's words on the terrace, the strange weight behind his voice when he spoke of decisions already made, of things that would surprise her. She had barely slept, her mind circling the same unanswered questions again and again. By the time the Duke's carriage arrived that afternoon, the house had been swept, the good china set out, and Margaret had changed her dress twice despite not being the one receiving the guest. Elinor, meanwhile, had chosen the simplest gown she owned, unwilling to appear as though she were trying too hard to impress a man whose intentions she still did not fully understand. When the Duke was shown into the sitting room, he looked, if possible, even more composed than he had the night before, dressed in dark, understated clothing that somehow made him appear both approachable and undeniably powerful at once. He bowed politely to Margaret, exchanged the necessary pleasantries, and then, with practiced ease, requested a private word with Elinor in the garden, a request Margaret granted with barely concealed delight. Once they were alone among the modest rows of flowers behind the house, the Duke's expression grew serious, the polished formality of the drawing-room falling away. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "Many," Elinor admitted. "Beginning with why a man such as yourself would take such interest in someone the rest of society considers beneath notice." The Duke walked slowly beside her along the garden path, his hands clasped behind his back, choosing his words with obvious care. "Several months ago," he began, "I attended a small gathering hosted by Lord Pembroke, a distant relation of mine. You were present that evening, though we exchanged no more than a handful of words. I remember you spent the better part of the night speaking with an elderly widow whom everyone else had abandoned near the refreshment table, simply because she had little of interest to offer socially. Elinor blinked, surprised he remembered such a small, forgettable moment. Mrs. Caldwell, she was lonely. It seemed unkind to leave her sitting there alone. Precisely my observation, the Duke said. You showed her kindness with nothing to gain from it. No one was watching, no one would have noticed had you simply walked past her as everyone else did, and yet you did not. That hardly seems reason enough too. It was not the only reason, he interrupted gently, but it was the beginning. From that evening forward, I found myself paying closer attention whenever our paths crossed. I watched how you treated servants, how you spoke of others when you believed no one of consequence was listening. I watched Miss Vance, and what I saw convinced me long before last night that you possessed a character I have rarely encountered among the women I am expected to court. Elinor stopped walking, turning to face him fully. You are telling me you had already decided something about me, before last night's events at all? Yes, his answer was immediate, without hesitation. The wine, the humiliation Lady Camilla and her companions arranged for you, none of that altered my decision. If anything, it only confirmed it. You did not crumble, you did not lash out. You simply endured with more dignity than most in that room could ever hope to possess. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the soft rustle of the garden around them. Elinor searched his face, trying to understand what exactly he was proposing, though some part of her had already begun to guess. Your Grace, she said carefully, are you suggesting that you intend to court me? I am suggesting, he said, that I already intended to before last night ever happened. Last night simply forced my hand sooner than I had planned. Elinor felt the ground shift slightly beneath her, though she remained rooted in place. Everything about this conversation felt impossible, the sort of thing that happened in stories told to children, not in the quiet garden behind her aunt's modest home. I do not understand why, she said finally. There are countless women of far greater standing who would welcome your attention without hesitation. That, the Duke said, his voice quieter now, is precisely the problem. Every woman I have ever considered courting wanted my title, my fortune, the position I could offer them. None of them not once showed genuine interest in the man beneath all of that. He paused, something vulnerable flickering briefly across his composed features. You, Miss Vance, did not even know I was watching you at all. Whatever kindness you showed, whatever grace you carried, none of it was performed for my benefit. That is rarer than you seem to realize. Elinor's chest tightened with an emotion she could not immediately name. For years she had grown accustomed to being overlooked, dismissed as unremarkable simply because she lacked the fortune and connections that mattered so much to the world around her. To hear a man of the Duke's standing speak of her with such quiet conviction felt almost disorienting. I will not pretend this does not frighten me, she admitted. Everything about my life has taught me to be cautious of sudden attention, particularly attention I have not sought. Then be cautious, the Duke said simply. I ask only for the opportunity to prove my intentions are genuine, nothing more. Before Elinor could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps drew both their attention toward the garden path. A young maid appeared, slightly breathless, informing them that a visitor had arrived at the front of the house, insisting on speaking with Elinor immediately. Who is it? Elinor asked. Lady Camilla Whitmore, miss, the maid said. She says the matter cannot wait. Elinor's stomach tightened. After everything that had unfolded the night before, she could not imagine what Camilla might want, though she doubted it was anything friendly. The Duke's expression darkened slightly, though he said nothing as they made their way back toward the house, Elinor bracing herself for whatever confrontation awaited her inside. Camilla stood stiffly in the sitting room when they entered, her usual composure noticeably strained. Margaret hovered nearby, clearly uncertain whether to remain or excuse herself, though the tension in the room made it obvious this was not a social call. Lady Camilla, Elinor said carefully, I confess I did not expect a visit from you today. Camilla's eyes flicked briefly toward the Duke before settling back on Elinor, something calculating hidden behind her carefully arranged features. I came to apologize, she said, her voice tight, clearly forced, for the incident last night. It was unbecoming behavior and I regret the embarrassment it caused you. The words sounded rehearsed, and Elinor suspected the apology had far more to do with the Duke's presence in the room than any genuine remorse. Still, she inclined her head politely. "Thank you," Elinor said. "I appreciate you saying so." Camilla's gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, something sharp glinting beneath the surface of her forced civility. "I do hope," she added, "that whatever attention you have received recently does not give you false expectations about your place in society, Miss Vance. Such attentions can be fleeting." The warning, thinly veiled as it was, hung heavy in the air. The Duke stepped forward slightly, his voice cool and measured. "I assure you, Lady Camilla, my attentions are anything but fleeting. I would advise you to remember that the next time you consider orchestrating another display such as the one last night." Camilla's face flushed, though she said nothing further, offering a stiff curtsy before excusing herself from the house entirely. The moment the door closed behind her, the tension in the room seemed to ease slightly, though Elinor remained troubled by the visit. "She will not simply let this go," Elinor murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "No," the Duke agreed quietly. "I suspect she will not, which is precisely why I intend to make my intentions toward you known publicly, and soon, so that no one mistakes what happened last night for anything less than deliberate." Elinor turned to face him, searching his expression for any hesitation, any doubt. She found none. "Then let them know," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I am done shrinking from rooms that were never kind to me in the first place." For the first time since he had arrived, the Duke smiled fully, an expression that transformed his usually composed features into something warmer, something almost boyish in its sincerity. "Then it seems," he said, "our understanding is settled after all." Neither of them could have known, standing together in that modest sitting room, with the afternoon light filtering through the windows, just how far Camilla was already prepared to go to ensure their understanding never reached its intended conclusion. 3 weeks passed, and with each passing day, the Duke's visits to the Whitfield household became less of a scandal and more of an accepted routine, though the whispers never fully faded. Elinor grew accustomed to the curious glances that followed her whenever she ventured into town, the way conversations would pause slightly as she passed, only to resume in hushed, eager tones the moment she was out of earshot. She had learned slowly to hold her chin higher against the attention rather than shrink from it. The Duke, whose given name she had finally been permitted to use in private, arrived one afternoon with an invitation that surprised her. "I would like you to see Ashworth Hall," Julian said, standing in the garden where so many of their conversations had taken place. "Not simply as a guest passing through for an evening's entertainment, but properly. I want you to understand the life you would be stepping into, should things between us continue as I hope they will." Elinor studied him carefully. "You wish to show me your estate?" "I wish to show you everything," he said. "The house, certainly, but also the tenants, the land, the responsibilities that come with the title most people only see as wealth and privilege. I do not want you entering this arrangement, if it comes to that, believing it to be nothing more than gowns and grand ballrooms." The following week, Elinor found herself seated in the Duke's carriage as it wound its way toward Ashworth Hall, the countryside rolling past in shades of green she had rarely had occasion to admire so closely. When the estate finally came into view, she understood immediately why it commanded such reverence throughout the county. The house rose from the landscape like something carved from the hills themselves, grand without being gaudy, its stone walls softened by ivy that had clearly been growing undisturbed for generations. "It is beautiful," Elinor said softly as the carriage came to a stop before the entrance. "It is a great deal of responsibility," Julian corrected gently, though there was pride evident in his voice as well. "Come, let me show you why." Rather than leading her immediately into the grand halls and formal rooms she expected, Julian guided her instead toward the surrounding farmland, where tenant families worked the fields that had sustained the estate for generations. He greeted several of them by name, asked after children she had never heard mentioned before, inquired about a recent illness that had passed through one of the cottages. The tenants, in turn, spoke to him not with the stiff formality Elinor had witnessed among the nobility, but with genuine warmth and familiarity. "You know them all," she observed as they walked back toward the main house later that afternoon. "They are as much a part of this estate as the walls of that house," Julian said. "My father believed differently. He saw them as numbers, as labor to be managed rather than people to be known. I promised myself when the title passed to me that I would not repeat his mistakes. Elinor found herself watching him with newfound admiration, understanding now why he had spoken so carefully about wanting her to see this side of his life before anything more formal was decided between them. This was not simply a man seeking a wife to complete some social arrangement. This was a man who carried real weight upon his shoulders, and who seemed, for reasons she still did not entirely understand, to believe she might be capable of sharing that weight alongside him. That evening, over a quiet dinner in a smaller, more intimate dining room than the grand hall she had expected, Julian finally spoke of the past he had alluded to weeks earlier, on the night of the ball. "Before I inherited the title," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I was engaged to a woman named Isabel Fairweather. I believed foolishly that our connection was genuine." Elinor set down her fork, giving him her full attention. "It was not until after our engagement was announced publicly that I discovered the truth," he continued. "Isabel's family was deeply in debt, a fact carefully concealed from society. Her interest in me had never been personal at all. I was, quite simply, a solution to her family's financial troubles." "How did you discover it?" Elinor asked gently. "A letter meant for her mother found its way into my hands by accident," Julian said. In it, she spoke quite plainly of her relief that our engagement would soon resolve her family's difficulties, and of her private disdain for spending her life bound to a man she considered, in her own words, tediously serious and unremarkable. Elinor's chest tightened at the quiet pain still evident beneath his composed retelling of the story. "I am sorry," she said softly. "That must have been a difficult thing to endure, particularly so publicly." "It taught me a valuable lesson," Julian said. "One I have carried with me every day since, that titles and fortunes attract interest certainly, but rarely attract honesty. Since that time, I have watched every woman who has shown interest in me with a healthy measure of suspicion, searching always for the same hidden motives that destroyed my trust in the first place." "And yet you sought me out," Elinor said, "despite that suspicion." "Because you never sought me at all," Julian said simply. "Not once, in all the months I observed you before last night, did you make any effort to draw my attention. If anything, you seemed entirely unaware I existed beyond the occasional polite greeting expected of strangers moving in the same social circles. That, Elinor, is precisely why I trust what I feel toward you far more than I have trusted any similar feeling before." The conversation settled something quietly between them, a deeper understanding neither had fully voiced until that moment. Elinor found herself reaching across the table, resting her hand gently over his. "I will not pretend to understand everything that comes with a life such as this one," she said. "But I promise you, whatever you decide to offer me, I have no interest in your title or your fortune. I am interested, quite simply, in you." Julian turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together with a tenderness that surprised her. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what I hoped to hear." Their evening continued long past what propriety might have strictly allowed, filled with quiet conversation that stretched from his hopes for the estate's future to smaller, more personal memories of childhood summers spent exploring the very grounds surrounding them now. By the time Elinor finally returned home that night, her heart felt fuller than it had in years, the uncertainty that had plagued her since the night of the ball finally beginning to settle into something resembling hope. She could not have known, as her carriage rolled quietly through the darkened countryside back toward her aunt's modest home, that Camilla Whitmore had spent that same evening in far less peaceful pursuits. Camilla sat in the dim light of her family's study, a half-finished letter spread across the desk before her, ink pooling slightly where her hand had trembled with frustration. Her cousin, Edmund Vance, sat across from her, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from the room. "You understand what you are asking of me," Edmund said quietly. "Elinor is my own family, however distant the connection." "I am asking you," Camilla said, her voice low and sharp, "to remember precisely where your own fortunes currently stand. Your gambling debts, Edmund, are hardly a secret among those who matter. I am offering you a solution to that particular problem, one that requires nothing more than a small, carefully worded letter." Edmund's jaw tightened. "You wish me to forge correspondence, suggesting Elinor's interest in the Duke is motivated purely by his wealth." "I wish you," Camilla said, leaning forward across the desk, "to remind the Duke precisely how easily appearances can be manipulated. Elinor Vance has spent her entire life believing herself invisible to men of consequence. Now suddenly, she finds herself courted by the most eligible bachelor in the country. Do you truly believe no one will question such a rapid change in fortune, unless we ensure the right questions are asked at the right time? Edmund studied the letter already partially drafted on the desk between them, his conscience visibly warring with the desperation of his circumstances. And if this is discovered? It will not be, Camilla said confidently. Not if executed carefully. The Duke already carries wounds from his past engagement. He is primed to believe the worst of any woman who shows him interest, regardless of how genuine that interest might appear. We simply need to plant the smallest seed of doubt, carefully enough that he begins questioning things entirely on his own. Edmund hesitated a long moment before finally reaching for the pen, though his hand trembled slightly as he did so. This feels dishonorable, Camilla. Dishonor, Camilla said coolly, is a luxury reserved for those who can still afford their debts, Edmund. I suggest you remember that the next time your conscience grows troublesome. As the candle burned lower in the dim study, the letter took shape between them, each carefully chosen word designed to plant doubt precisely where it would do the most damage, in the fragile, newly forming trust between Julian Ashworth and the woman he had chosen, against all expectation, to place his faith in. Neither Camilla nor Edmund could have fully understood, as they sealed the finished letter that night, just how deeply their scheme would eventually unravel, nor how thoroughly it would ultimately expose their own carefully hidden desperation rather than the falsehoods they hoped to attach to Elinor's name. But that reckoning was still weeks away. For now the letter sat sealed and waiting, a quiet threat hidden beneath the surface of a courtship that had, until this moment, seemed finally to be finding its footing. The letter arrived at Ashworth Hall on a grey morning, tucked among a stack of ordinary correspondence that Julian's steward delivered to his study without any particular ceremony. Julian did not notice it immediately, occupied as he was with matters concerning the upcoming harvest and a dispute between two tenant families over a shared boundary line. It was not until midday, when he finally worked his way through the remaining letters, that he broke the unfamiliar seal and began to read. The handwriting was unfamiliar, though it claimed, quite convincingly, to belong to a close friend of Elinor's from her earlier years, someone who insisted on remaining unnamed but who felt compelled, out of concern for the Duke's well-being, to share certain troubling observations. The letter spoke of private conversations supposedly overheard, in which Elinor had allegedly expressed relief at having finally secured the attention of a wealthy suitor after years of financial hardship, and disdain at having to endure his company in exchange for the security his fortune promised. Julian read the letter twice, then a third time, his expression darkening with each pass. The words felt calculated, precise in the way they echoed almost exactly the kind of betrayal he had suffered once before. He set the letter down slowly, his hands unsteady despite his best efforts to remain composed. He wanted desperately to dismiss it outright. Everything he had witnessed of Elinor's character in the weeks since the ball contradicted every accusation contained within those carefully chosen words. And yet the wound from his past engagement ran deeper than he often allowed himself to acknowledge, and doubt, once introduced, proved remarkably difficult to fully extinguish. He did not send for Elinor immediately. Instead, he spent the following days in uncharacteristic silence, canceling a planned visit under the pretense of pressing estate business, avoiding correspondence that might require him to address the growing unease settling in his chest. Elinor noticed the change immediately. Julian's letters, once frequent and warm, grew sparse and formal, lacking the easy affection that had characterized their exchanges since Ashworth Hall. When she finally received word that he would call upon her, the tone of his note carried none of its usual warmth, simply stating that he wished to discuss a matter of some importance. "Something is wrong," Elinor said to her aunt the morning of his expected visit, pacing the length of the sitting room with barely restrained anxiety. "I can feel it in every word of his letters this past week." "You are perhaps imagining troubles that do not exist," Margaret offered gently, though even she seemed less than fully convinced by her own reassurance. When Julian arrived that afternoon, his demeanor confirmed every fear Elinor had been carrying. He greeted her with careful politeness, devoid of the warmth she had grown accustomed to, and requested a private conversation in the garden with an informality that felt almost like a stranger's request rather than a man who had, only weeks earlier, held her hand across a quiet dinner table and spoken of trust. "Julian," she said once they were alone among the flowers, "please tell me what has happened. You have been distant for days, and I confess I do not understand why." He hesitated, clearly wrestling with how to proceed. Finally, he withdrew the letter from his coat and handed it to her without further explanation. "This arrived several days ago," he said. "I would like to hear your response to its contents." Elinor read the letter with growing horror, her hands trembling as the accusations settled over her like a physical weight. "This is a lie," she said, looking up at him with desperate sincerity. "Every word of it, Julian. I have never spoken such things to anyone because I have never felt such things. You must believe me." "I want to believe you," Julian said quietly, though the strain in his voice betrayed how genuinely torn he felt. "But you must understand, Elinor, I have been deceived before by someone I trusted completely." The words in this letter echo almost precisely the private thoughts Isabel once expressed about me. Thoughts I never suspected until it was far too late to protect myself from their consequences. "I am not Isabel," Elinor said, her voice rising with a mixture of hurt and frustration. "I have given you no reason to doubt me, beyond the anonymous word of someone who refuses even to sign their own name to such accusations. Does that not strike you as suspicious in itself?" Julian's jaw tightened, clearly torn between the logic of her argument and the old wound reopened by the letter's carefully chosen words. "I do not know who sent it," he admitted, "nor can I immediately determine whether its contents hold any truth. But I cannot simply dismiss it outright, Elinor, not when the stakes involved are so significant." Elinor felt something inside her crack slightly at his words, the fragile trust they had built together over the past weeks, suddenly feeling far less secure than she had believed. "So you would rather trust the word of an anonymous coward than the woman who has shared her honest thoughts and feelings with you these past several weeks?" "I did not say that," Julian said, though his hesitation suggested otherwise. "You did not need to," Elinor replied, her voice quieter now, edged with hurt rather than anger. "I understand, Julian, truly I do, how deeply that past betrayal must have wounded you. But I cannot spend whatever future we might share constantly defending myself against ghosts that have nothing to do with me." A heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of birds settling into the trees surrounding the garden. Julian studied her carefully, searching her expression for any hint of the deception the letter had suggested, finding instead only genuine hurt and frustration. "I will look into the matter further," he said finally. "I owe you that much at the very least before drawing any final conclusions." "And in the meantime," Elinor asked, "am I simply expected to wait, wondering whether you believe me capable of such deceit?" Julian did not immediately answer, and his silence spoke louder than any words might have. Elinor felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall in front of him. "I think," she said finally, "you should go, Julian. Until you have resolved whatever doubts remain in your mind, I do not believe further conversation between us will accomplish anything productive." He hesitated a long moment, clearly wanting to say something more, but ultimately he simply nodded, offering a stiff bow before departing the garden without further words. Elinor remained standing among the flowers long after his carriage had disappeared down the road, the weight of the accusation and his uncertain response settling heavily over everything she had begun to hope for. That evening, alone in her room, Elinor finally allowed herself to cry, the tears she had held back throughout the difficult conversation finally spilling freely. She thought of the humiliation at the ball, of the wine-stained gown, of Julian's steady kindness in the weeks that followed, and wondered bitterly whether all of it had simply been building toward this moment, a fragile trust shattered by a single anonymous letter and the ghosts of a betrayal that had nothing to do with her at all. She did not yet know the letter's true origin, though she suspected, with growing certainty, precisely who might benefit most from such carefully orchestrated doubt. Camilla Whitmore's warning, delivered weeks earlier in the very same sitting room where Julian had once declared his intentions so openly, echoed now with new and troubling clarity. "Whatever attention you have received recently does not give you false expectations about your place in society. Such attentions can be fleeting." Elinor understood now, with painful certainty, that Camilla had never intended to simply let the matter rest. The following morning, determined not to allow the accusation to stand unanswered, Elinor made the difficult decision to seek out the truth herself, rather than wait helplessly while Julian's own investigation unfolded at whatever pace he deemed appropriate. She began, quietly, by speaking with those closest to her, searching for any hint of who might have crafted such a carefully targeted deception. It was her aunt, surprisingly, who provided the first meaningful clue. "I saw your cousin Edmund in town yesterday," Margaret mentioned during breakfast, seemingly unaware of the significance her words carried. "He seemed troubled, more so than usual. I heard mention from Mrs. Caldwell of all people that his debts have grown rather severe recently. Apparently he has been seen in the company of Lady Camilla Whitmore on several occasions this past month, which struck several people as rather curious, given they move in such different circles." Elinor set down her teacup slowly, a chill settling over her as the pieces began arranging themselves into an unmistakable pattern. Edmund, her own cousin, distant though the connection was, entangled with Camilla in ways that suddenly made a great deal of troubling sense. "Aunt Margaret," Elinor said carefully, "I believe I may need to pay Edmund a visit." Margaret frowned slightly, sensing the shift in her niece's demeanor. "Is something wrong, dear?" "I am beginning to understand," Elinor said quietly, "precisely who wishes to see my courtship with the Duke destroyed, and precisely how far they seem willing to go in order to accomplish it." Edmund Vance lived in a modest set of rooms above a tailor's shop on the edge of town, far removed from the grandeur of the ballrooms and estates that filled the world Elinor had recently found herself moving through. She arrived unannounced, her heart pounding as she climbed the narrow staircase leading to his door, uncertain exactly what she intended to say once she stood before him. Edmund answered her knock with visible surprise, quickly masked by an uneasy attempt at pleasantries. "Elinor, I had not expected a visit. Please come in, though I am afraid my rooms offer little in the way of comfortable hospitality." The small sitting room was sparse, the furniture worn and mismatched, a stark contrast to the fine clothing Edmund typically wore in public. Elinor noticed several unopened letters scattered across a side table, along with what appeared to be notices from creditors, their formal seals unmistakable even from a distance. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, Edmund," Elinor said, choosing directness over the careful diplomacy she might normally have employed. "I understand you have grown close with Lady Camilla Whitmore in recent weeks." Edmund's expression flickered, something guarded settling behind his eyes. "We share certain mutual acquaintances," he said carefully. "I would not describe our association as particularly close." "I received word that you have been seen in her company on several occasions," Elinor pressed. "Occasions that struck others as rather curious, given how little your usual social circles overlap." Edmund shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her direct gaze. "I am not certain what you are suggesting, Elinor." "I am suggesting," Elinor said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, "that a letter recently reached the Duke of Ashworth, filled with fabricated accusations about my character, written by someone claiming close acquaintance with me. I am suggesting that whoever crafted such a letter would need intimate knowledge of both my circumstances and my connection to the Duke, knowledge that few people outside my immediate family would possess." The color drained slowly from Edmund's face, his composure crumbling beneath the weight of her accusation. "Elinor, Please," she interrupted, her voice softening slightly despite her hurt. "Whatever debts you owe, whatever pressure Camilla has placed upon you, I need to understand the truth, Edmund. Not for my own sake alone, but because whatever damage this letter has caused between myself and the Duke threatens everything I have only just begun to hope for." Edmund sank slowly into a nearby chair, his earlier defensiveness giving way to visible shame. "My gambling debts have grown severe," he admitted quietly. "Severe enough that I fear debtor's prison should they remain unpaid much longer. Camilla approached me several weeks ago, offering to settle my debts entirely in exchange for a small favor." "The letter," Elinor said, though it was not truly a question. Edmund nodded miserably. "She provided most of the details herself, insisting they carried enough truth woven through the fabrication to make the whole letter believable. I told myself it was a small thing, a minor deception that would ultimately amount to nothing significant. I did not fully consider how deeply it might wound you, nor how thoroughly it might damage something you clearly value a great deal." Elinor felt a complicated tangle of emotions rising within her, anger at his willing participation in Camilla's scheme, but also a measure of sympathy for the desperation that had driven him to it. "Will you help me undo the damage?" she asked finally. Will you tell the Duke the truth in your own words about who orchestrated this letter and why?" Edmund hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences of exposing Camilla against the guilt already weighing heavily upon his conscience. "If I do so," he said slowly, "Camilla will withdraw her promise to settle my debts. I will face consequences I have spent weeks desperately trying to avoid." "And if you do not," Elinor countered, "you will spend the rest of your life knowing you allowed a lie to destroy something genuine, simply to protect yourself from consequences you brought upon yourself through your own choices. Edmund, I understand your fear, but this cannot continue unanswered." A long silence stretched between them before Edmund finally nodded, something resembling relief settling over his troubled features, as though he had been waiting, quietly, for someone to give him permission to abandon the deception weighing so heavily upon him. "I will speak with the Duke," he said finally. "I owe you that much, Elinor, whatever consequences follow." Before they could discuss the matter further, a soft knock interrupted them, followed by the entrance of an older woman Elinor did not immediately recognize, dressed in the plain, practical clothing of household service. "Forgive the intrusion," the woman said, glancing nervously between Elinor and Edmund. "My name is Hannah Brooks. I formerly served in Lady Camilla's household until my dismissal several weeks ago. I could not help but overhear portions of your conversation through the thin walls of this building, and I believe I may possess information that could prove useful to you, Miss Vance." Elinor turned toward the woman with cautious curiosity. "What information do you have?" Hannah glanced briefly at Edmund before continuing. "I was present in Lady Camilla's household the evening she and Mr. Vance drafted the letter in question. I overheard a great deal of their conversation, details that confirm precisely what has just been discussed between the two of you. I was dismissed shortly afterward, under circumstances I still do not fully understand, though I have long suspected it was simply to ensure my silence regarding what I witnessed." "Would you be willing to testify to what you heard?" Elinor asked, hope rising cautiously within her chest. "Before the Duke himself, if necessary." Hannah nodded firmly. "Lady Camilla dismissed me without wages owed, without reference, without any consideration for the difficulty such treatment would cause someone in my position. I owe her no loyalty whatsoever, Miss Vance. I would be glad to see the truth finally brought into the light." For the first time since the letter had first arrived at Ashworth Hall, Elinor felt something resembling genuine hope settling over her. With Edmund's confession and Hannah's corroborating testimony, she finally possessed the means to expose Camilla's scheme entirely, and perhaps, if fortune favored her, to repair whatever damage had been done to her fragile trust with Julian. "There is little time to waste," Elinor said, rising from her seat with newfound determination. "The Duke deserves to hear the truth as soon as possible, directly from those who orchestrated the deception against him." Edmund rose as well, though his expression remained troubled. "And Camilla, she will not simply accept exposure without retaliation of her own." "Then we shall face whatever retaliation she attempts," Elinor said, "together and with the truth firmly on our side." As the three of them made their way toward Ashworth Hall that same afternoon, none of them could have anticipated just how dramatically the coming confrontation would unfold, nor how completely it would finally unravel the careful web of lies Camilla Whitmore had spent weeks constructing. Julian was in his study when the unexpected visitors were announced, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded caution as Elinor entered, followed closely by Edmund and an unfamiliar woman he did not immediately recognize. "Elinor," he said, rising from his desk, "I had not expected." "I have brought the truth, Julian," Elinor interrupted, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her, "regarding the letter and regarding exactly who orchestrated its creation." Julian's gaze shifted toward Edmund, recognition slowly dawning across his features. "You are Elinor's cousin." "I am," Edmund confirmed, his voice heavy with shame. "And I am the one who wrote the letter you received, Your Grace, though the scheme itself was not my own creation." Julian's expression darkened considerably as Edmund proceeded to explain everything: Camilla's proposal, the settlement of his debts offered in exchange for the fabricated accusations, the careful crafting of details designed specifically to echo the wounds of Julian's past betrayal. Hannah added her own testimony, confirming every detail of the scheme she had personally witnessed unfold within Camilla's own household. By the time the full account had been laid before him, Julian's expression had shifted from guarded suspicion to something closer to controlled fury. "I owe you a significant apology," he said finally, turning to face Elinor directly. "I allowed old wounds to cloud my judgment, when I should have trusted the character you have shown me consistently since the moment we met properly. I am deeply sorry, Elinor." "You were not entirely without reason for caution," Elinor said gently, though relief flooded through her at his sincere acknowledgement. "Camilla crafted the letter with enough familiarity with your past to make doubt almost unavoidable. I do not fault you for questioning it, Julian. I simply could not allow the lie to stand unanswered." Julian studied her for a long moment, something warm and grateful settling behind his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me enough to bring the truth forward yourself, rather than allowing the deception to simply fester between us." Turning his attention to Edmund, Julian's expression grew more serious once more. "You understand, of course, that this scheme carries consequences, regardless of your willingness to eventually confess the truth." Edmund nodded solemnly. "I do, Your Grace. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." "We shall discuss the specifics separately," Julian said. "For now, I am simply grateful the truth has finally come to light before further damage could be done." As Edmund and Hannah were shown out to await further discussion, Julian turned back toward Elinor, closing the distance between them with quiet determination. "I do not deserve your continued trust after doubting you so readily," he said softly, "but I hope you will allow me the opportunity to earn it back properly." Elinor felt the earlier hurt slowly beginning to ease, replaced by the same steady warmth that had characterized their courtship since its unlikely beginning. "You have already begun," she said, "simply by listening to the truth once it was presented to you, rather than clinging stubbornly to doubt." Julian reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together with the same tenderness she remembered from their evening together at Ashworth Hall. "There is still the matter of Camilla Whitmore to address," he said. "She will not simply accept the unraveling of her scheme without some manner of retaliation." "No," Elinor agreed quietly, "I do not imagine she will." Neither of them could yet know precisely how dramatically that final confrontation would unfold, nor how thoroughly it would ultimately determine the course of everything they had built together since that fateful evening, when a spilled glass of wine had first drawn them together beneath the watchful eyes of an entire ballroom. News of Edmund's confession reached Camilla within a matter of days, delivered by a nervous household servant who had overheard fragments of conversation among the staff at Ashworth Hall. Camilla received the news in stony silence, her carefully maintained composure cracking only slightly as the full weight of the situation settled over her. She had gambled everything on the letter succeeding, certain that Julian's old wounds would prevent him from ever questioning its authenticity too closely. She had not accounted for Elinor's determination, nor for Edmund's fragile conscience ultimately overriding his desperation. "This cannot stand," Camilla muttered to herself, pacing the length of her private sitting room. "I will not allow that girl to humiliate me a second time." Her mother, Lady Whitmore, entered the room shortly afterward, her expression grave. "Camilla, word has reached me of certain troubling rumors circulating through the household staff. Rumors concerning a letter and your involvement in its creation." Camilla's jaw tightened. "Servants gossip, mother, it means nothing." "It means everything," Lady Whitmore said sharply. "Should such rumors reach the wrong ears before we have the opportunity to control the narrative ourselves. I raised you to understand the delicate nature of reputation within society, Camilla. If these accusations prove true and Edmund Vance has indeed confessed his involvement, we must act swiftly to protect our own standing." "What would you have me do?" Camilla asked, frustration bleeding into her voice. "The truth has already reached the Duke. There is little room remaining to control anything." Lady Whitmore considered the matter carefully, her expression calculating despite the concern evident beneath it. "There is one course remaining," she said finally. "A grand ball is planned for the end of the month, hosted by Lord Pembroke, attended by everyone of consequence throughout the county. If the Duke intends to formally announce his intentions toward Miss Vance, it will almost certainly occur at that gathering. We must ensure, Camilla, that whatever occurs there works in our favor rather than against it." "How do you propose we accomplish that?" Camilla asked. "By controlling the story before anyone else has the opportunity to tell it fully," Lady Whitmore said. "If you confront the matter publicly, before Edmund or Elinor have the chance to expose you first, you may yet salvage some measure of sympathy. Claim confusion, claim manipulation by Edmund himself, whatever narrative proves most convincing. Society is often more forgiving of those who appear to be victims rather than villains. Camilla considered her mother's proposal carefully, a plan slowly forming behind her calculating gaze. Whatever guilt she might have felt over the scheme's unraveling was rapidly giving way to a desperate determination to protect herself from the consequences now bearing down upon her. Meanwhile, at Ashworth Hall, preparations for Lord Pembroke's ball proceeded with an entirely different sense of purpose. Julian had made his decision clear to Elinor during a quiet conversation held several days after the truth of the letter had finally come to light. "I intend to announce our engagement formally at Lord Pembroke's ball," he said, watching her carefully for her reaction. "I understand this decision comes swiftly, given everything that has unfolded these past weeks, but I find I no longer wish to leave any room for doubt, either in society's perception or in my own heart, regarding my intentions toward you." Elinor's breath caught slightly at the directness of his declaration. "Julian, are you certain? So much has happened in such a short span of time." "I have never been more certain of anything," he said, taking her hands gently in his own. "The letter, the doubt it created, the truth that eventually emerged despite every obstacle placed before it, none of it altered what I already knew to be true about you, Elinor. If anything, it only confirmed it further. You fought for the truth for us, even when circumstances gave you every reason to walk away instead." Elinor felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though these carried none of the pain from their earlier confrontation, only overwhelming relief and quiet joy. "Then yes," she said softly, "I would be honored to accept Julian. Whatever challenges still await us." Word of the impending announcement spread quickly through society, ensuring that Lord Pembroke's ball would draw an even larger crowd than usual, everyone eager to witness firsthand the conclusion of a courtship that had captivated the county's attention since that fateful evening weeks earlier. Elinor spent the days leading up to the ball in a strange mixture of anticipation and lingering unease, aware that Camilla remained a threat despite the truth having already reached Julian's ears. Her aunt, ever practical despite her excitement over the upcoming announcement, offered gentle reassurance whenever Elinor's nerves threatened to overwhelm her. "Whatever Camilla intends," Margaret said one evening, helping Elinor select the gown she would wear to the ball, "the Duke has already made his position clear. She cannot undo what has already been decided between the two of you, no matter how desperately she might wish otherwise." Elinor nodded, though the memory of the wine-stained gown, of Camilla's calculated cruelty on that first fateful evening, remained fresh enough in her mind to prevent complete reassurance. "I simply wish to see this evening through without further incident," she admitted. "I have grown weary of Camilla's schemes, disrupting what should otherwise be a joyful occasion." "Then hold your head high, exactly as you did that first evening," Margaret said, smoothing the fabric of the deep green gown Elinor had finally selected. "You have already proven time and again that you possess far more strength than Camilla Whitmore could ever hope to match." On the evening of the ball, Elinor arrived at Lord Pembroke's estate on Julian's arm, the grand entrance hall filled with the same glittering assembly of society that had witnessed her humiliation weeks earlier. This time, however, the whispers that followed her passage carried an entirely different tone, curious anticipation replacing the mocking cruelty of that first evening. Camilla was already present when they arrived, positioned prominently near the center of the ballroom, her expression carefully composed despite the tension evident in the rigid set of her shoulders. As Julian and Elinor made their way through the crowd, Camilla's gaze followed them with calculated precision, clearly waiting for the opportune moment to enact whatever plan she had devised. The moment arrived sooner than Elinor expected, interrupting the evening's festivities just as the orchestra paused between pieces. Camilla stepped forward into the small clearing near the center of the room, raising her voice with practiced confidence designed to carry across the entire gathering. "Your Grace," she called out, drawing immediate attention from the surrounding crowd. "Before this evening proceeds further, I feel compelled to address certain troubling rumors that have reached my ears regarding recent events." Julian's expression grew guarded, though he remained composed as the assembled crowd turned their attention fully toward the unfolding confrontation. "Lady Camilla," he said evenly, "I would advise caution regarding whatever you intend to say next. I simply wish to clarify my own involvement in certain unfortunate misunderstandings," Camilla continued, her voice carrying practiced innocence despite the calculation evident beneath it. "I fear I may have been unfairly manipulated by Mr. Edmund Vance, who approached me some weeks ago with troubling information regarding his cousin's character, information I foolishly allowed him to convince me was accurate." Elinor felt her chest tighten at the blatant reversal of the truth, watching as murmurs rippled through the surrounding crowd, several faces turning toward her with renewed curiosity and suspicion. "That is not what occurred," Elinor said, stepping forward despite the nervous energy coursing through her. "Lady Camilla approached my cousin, not the reverse, offering to settle his significant debts in exchange for crafting a false letter designed specifically to damage the Duke's trust in me." "A convenient claim," Camilla countered smoothly, "though I suppose one might expect nothing less from a woman desperate to protect a courtship that has elevated her far beyond her natural station." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, the confrontation drawing every eye in the ballroom. Before Elinor could respond further, a familiar voice cut through the tension from near the entrance of the room. "I believe I can clarify the matter definitively." Hannah Brooks stepped forward from where she had been quietly waiting near the periphery of the gathering, her presence drawing confused glances from the assembled crowd, unaccustomed to seeing a former household servant address such an esteemed gathering directly. "I served in Lady Camilla's household until my recent dismissal," Hannah continued, her voice steady despite the daunting audience surrounding her. "I personally witnessed the evening Lady Camilla and Mr. Edmund Vance drafted the letter in question in her family's private study. Every detail of the scheme originated from Lady Camilla herself, offered in exchange for settling Mr. Vance's considerable gambling debts." Camilla's composure finally cracked visibly, her face draining of color as Hannah's testimony settled over the stunned crowd. "This is absurd," Camilla said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "A dismissed servant, clearly seeking some manner of petty revenge against my family." "I have no reason to lie, Lady Camilla," Hannah interrupted calmly. "I have nothing left to gain or lose within society's opinion of me. I simply wish to see the truth acknowledged, after witnessing firsthand the harm your scheme very nearly caused." Edmund Vance emerged from the crowd as well, his expression heavy with shame but resolute nonetheless. "Everything Hannah has said is accurate," he confirmed. "I bear my own share of responsibility for participating in the scheme, and I do not seek to excuse my involvement. But the plan itself, every detail of the fabricated letter, originated entirely from Lady Camilla." The ballroom fell into stunned silence, every eye now fixed upon Camilla as the full weight of her exposed deceptions settled over the gathering. Her mother, Lady Whitmore, stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, her earlier confidence in their carefully constructed narrative crumbling entirely beneath the combined testimony now laid bare before all of society. Julian stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "I believe the truth of this matter has now been made sufficiently clear to everyone present," he said. "Lady Camilla, I would suggest you consider carefully the consequences of continuing to insist upon a narrative that has just been thoroughly disproven before witnesses of considerable standing." Camilla opened her mouth as though to protest further, but no words emerged. The crowd's expressions had shifted entirely, sympathy and curiosity replaced now by open disapproval and quiet judgment. Without another word, Camilla turned and fled the ballroom, her mother following swiftly behind her, the whispers erupting in their wake carrying an entirely different tone than the ones that had once followed Elinor's own humiliation weeks earlier. Elinor stood in the center of the ballroom, momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune, before Julian's steady hand found hers once more, grounding her amid the chaos still settling around them. "It is over," he said quietly, meeting her eyes with quiet relief. "Whatever damage Camilla hoped to inflict, it has ultimately exposed only her own dishonesty, rather than anything resembling the truth about you." Elinor felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying since that very first evening, weeks earlier, when a spilled glass of wine had first threatened to define her entirely in the eyes of society. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing beside me through all of it." Julian raised her hand gently to his lips, the gesture drawing renewed attention from the surrounding crowd, though this time carrying nothing but genuine warmth and admiration. "I intend to stand beside you," he said, "for a great deal longer than simply this evening, if you will permit me the honor." As the orchestra resumed its interrupted melody, and the assembled crowd slowly returned to the evening's festivities, Elinor understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she had finally proven, beyond any doubt, exactly the kind of strength and character that had first drawn Julian's quiet attention so many months before this remarkable evening had ever unfolded. With the truth of Camilla's scheme now fully exposed before all of society, the tension that had shadowed the ballroom slowly gave way to something lighter, though the evening's dramatic turn continued to ripple through hushed conversations across the room. Julian did not allow the moment to pass without purpose. Once the initial shock had settled, and the orchestra had resumed its gentle melody, he requested the musicians pause once more, drawing the attention of the gathered crowd for an announcement he had originally intended to make regardless of Camilla's failed interference. "Friends," Julian began, his voice carrying easily across the now attentive ballroom, "many of you have followed the events of these past weeks with considerable interest and no small amount of speculation. I see little reason to delay any longer in settling that speculation definitively." He turned toward Elinor, taking her hand once more in his own, his expression open and sincere in a way that drew soft murmurs of anticipation from the crowd. "Miss Elinor Vance has shown me, since the very first evening I properly understood her character, a strength and honesty I have found in no other woman throughout my life. Tonight, before all of you, I wish to make clear that my intentions toward her are neither fleeting nor born of impulse, but rather the result of careful and deliberate choice, made long before circumstance forced my hand." A ripple of surprised whispers spread through the assembly, though none carried the mocking edge that had once followed Elinor everywhere she went. Julian continued, his gaze never leaving Elinor's face. "I formally announce my engagement to Miss Elinor Vance, and I do so with complete confidence, knowing that whatever challenges we may face together in the future, we shall face them with the same honesty and resolve that brought us to this moment tonight." The ballroom erupted into a mixture of applause and astonished conversation, the reversal of fortune from the evening's earlier drama giving the announcement an added weight of drama and romance that would undoubtedly fuel conversation throughout the county for weeks to come. Elinor felt her cheeks flush with a combination of joy and lingering disbelief, the moment feeling almost too large to fully absorb standing in the middle of it. Lord Pembroke himself approached shortly afterward, offering warm congratulations along with a request that the couple join him for the traditional first dance of celebration, an honor rarely extended so publicly. As Julian led her toward the center of the ballroom floor, Elinor caught sight of several familiar faces among the crowd, their expressions no longer carrying judgment or mockery, but something closer to genuine warmth and respect. Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly widow Elinor had once shown quiet kindness to at a gathering months earlier, offered a gentle smile and a small nod as they passed, a silent acknowledgement of how far the evening had carried them both from that seemingly insignificant moment of simple decency. As the music began and Julian drew her into the familiar steps of the dance, Elinor allowed herself, for the first time all evening, to simply enjoy the moment without the weight of uncertainty or fear hanging over her. "You seem lighter," Julian observed, studying her expression carefully as they moved together across the floor. "I feel lighter," Elinor admitted. "For weeks, I have carried the fear that everything between us might unravel at the slightest provocation, that Camilla's determination to see us separated might eventually succeed despite our best efforts. Tonight, that fear finally feels as though it belongs entirely to the past." "It does," Julian confirmed. "Whatever influence Camilla once held within society has been thoroughly diminished by her own actions tonight. I suspect her family will find themselves facing considerably more scrutiny in the coming months than either of them anticipated when this scheme was first conceived." Elinor considered this for a moment, surprised to find that whatever satisfaction she might have expected to feel at Camilla's downfall felt strangely muted. "I do not wish to see her utterly ruined," she admitted. "Whatever cruelty she showed me, I find I have little appetite for revenge, particularly now that the truth has already been so thoroughly established." Julian studied her with quiet admiration. "That," he said, "is precisely the kind of grace that first drew my attention to you, months before either of us understood where this path might eventually lead." As their dance concluded, the evening continued late into the night, filled with congratulations from guests eager to align themselves with the newly announced engagement, along with quieter, more genuine well wishes from those who had watched Elinor's difficult journey through recent weeks with real sympathy. By the time she finally returned home, exhausted but deeply content, Elinor understood that whatever trials still awaited her in the unfamiliar world she was preparing to enter, she would face them with a partner whose trust had been tested thoroughly enough to prove itself genuine beyond any reasonable doubt. The weeks following the ball passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations, formal introductions to extended branches of Julian's family, and the slow, steady process of Elinor settling into a role that society had never expected her to occupy. She learned quickly that not every challenge ahead would involve dramatic confrontations or elaborate schemes. Some simply required patience, careful diplomacy, and the quiet confidence she had discovered within herself throughout the ordeal with Camilla. Edmund, true to his word, cooperated fully with whatever consequences Julian ultimately decided upon, a private arrangement that saw his most pressing debts settled through honest labor managing certain administrative affairs for the Ashworth estate, rather than through any further deception or manipulation. The arrangement offered him a genuine path toward redemption, one he approached with visible gratitude and renewed determination to rebuild the trust he had damaged through his earlier choices. Camilla and her family, meanwhile, found their standing within society considerably diminished following the public exposure of her scheme. Invitations grew sparse, whispered conversations followed them through whatever gatherings they still managed to attend, and the confident bearing Camilla had once carried so effortlessly gave way to something far more cautious and subdued. Elinor heard occasional reports of her circumstances through mutual acquaintances, though she found herself feeling less satisfaction in Camilla's downfall than simple relief that the matter had finally been resolved, allowing her own life to move forward unburdened by further schemes or interference. On a quiet afternoon several weeks before the wedding, Elinor found herself once again walking the familiar garden paths at Ashworth Hall, this time not as a hesitant visitor uncertain of her place, but as a woman who had thoroughly earned her position within these grounds through resilience and honest character rather than fortune or inherited status. Julian joined her there, as he often did during these quiet afternoons, his presence no longer carrying the careful formality of their earliest encounters, but rather the easy familiarity of two people who had weathered genuine hardship together and emerged stronger for having done so. "I have been thinking," he said, settling beside her on a stone bench overlooking the estate's expansive grounds, "about that first evening at the ball, and how differently everything might have unfolded had circumstances been even slightly altered." "In what way?" Elinor asked. "Had Camilla never orchestrated her cruel display with the wine, had I not already resolved months earlier to seek your acquaintance more seriously, our paths might never have crossed in quite the same manner. It strikes me as remarkable, looking back, how something intended purely as humiliation ultimately became the very moment that brought us together so publicly." Elinor considered this, a small smile touching her lips as she remembered the mortification of that evening, so distant now from the contentment she currently felt. "I suppose," she said, "we owe Camilla a strange sort of gratitude, however unintentional her contribution to our happiness may have been." Julian laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. "I imagined she would find little comfort in that particular interpretation of events." "No," Elinor agreed, smiling. "I imagined she would not." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the afternoon light shift gently across the grounds that would soon become Elinor's permanent home. Whatever uncertainties still remained regarding the life ahead of her, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely secure in her place within it. "I love you, Elinor," Julian said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "Not for your grace during that first humiliation, nor for the strength you showed throughout everything Camilla attempted afterward, though both revealed a great deal about your character. I love you simply for who you are, in the quiet moments no one else ever witnesses." Elinor felt her heart swell with the same overwhelming warmth she had experienced that very first night, when he had offered her his coat before the entire assembled ballroom, choosing her openly despite every reason society might have offered him to look elsewhere. "I love you as well," she said softly. "More than I ever believed possible, particularly given how our story began." As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the gardens of Ashworth Hall, Elinor understood with complete certainty that whatever the future held, she had found in Julian not simply a partner of considerable wealth and status, but a companion whose genuine character matched her own, forged through hardship into something far more valuable than either title or fortune could ever provide. The wedding, when it finally arrived weeks later, brought together the same society that had once mocked Elinor so cruelly, though this time gathered to celebrate rather than humiliate. Standing before the assembled guests, exchanging vows with the man who had chosen her long before circumstance had ever forced his hand, Elinor felt the last remnants of her earlier insecurity finally dissolve entirely. She was no longer simply the modest gentlewoman society had once dismissed as unremarkable, nor merely the victim of Camilla's cruel prank that had briefly threatened to define her entire future. She was, quite simply, Elinor Ashworth, chosen not for what she could offer in status or fortune, but for the genuine character she had carried with her all along, waiting patiently for someone willing to look closely enough to recognize its true value. As Julian slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her close for their first kiss as husband and wife, the assembled crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the same grand halls that had once witnessed her deepest humiliation, now filled instead with genuine celebration of a love that had proven, time and again, strong enough to withstand every obstacle placed deliberately in its path. The wine-stained gown that had once seemed destined to define her downfall had instead become, in the strange and unpredictable way that life sometimes unfolds, the very beginning of everything Elinor had never dared to hope for. Life at Ashworth Hall settled into a rhythm neither Elinor nor Julian had fully anticipated during the whirlwind of their courtship. The grand house, once intimidating in its scale and history, slowly became something warmer under Elinor's quiet influence. She spent her mornings walking the tenant farms alongside Julian, learning the names of children she had only heard mentioned in passing, listening carefully to concerns that previous generations of the family had too often overlooked. The tenants, wary at first of a new mistress unfamiliar with the estate's long-standing traditions, soon came to trust her, drawn by the same genuine warmth that had once caught Julian's attention from a distance. Autumn arrived with its own set of quiet challenges. A blight threatened a portion of the harvest on the estate's eastern fields, and where Julian's father might once have responded with cold dismissal toward the affected tenant families, Julian and Elinor together devised a plan to redistribute resources fairly, ensuring no single family bore the full weight of the loss alone. It was not the kind of drama that filled ballroom gossip, but it was the kind of steady, quiet partnership that Elinor had always hoped her marriage might become. Camilla's name surfaced only rarely in conversation after the wedding, most often in hushed tones carrying more pity than malice. Word eventually reached Ashworth Hall that she had left the county entirely, relocating to live with distant relatives in a quieter part of the country, far removed from the society that had once celebrated her sharp wit and beauty before turning so swiftly against her following the exposure of her scheme. Elinor felt no satisfaction in the news, only a distant, complicated sympathy for a woman whose cruelty had ultimately cost her everything she had once valued most. Edmund, meanwhile, continued his work managing portions of the estate's correspondence and accounts, slowly rebuilding not only his finances but his own sense of self-respect. He visited Elinor and Julian occasionally for quiet family dinners, the awkwardness of his earlier betrayal gradually softening into something resembling genuine gratitude for the second chance he had been given. He never again allowed his circumstances to tempt him toward dishonesty, having learned, more thoroughly than any lecture could have taught him, the true cost of deception. Nearly a year after their wedding, Elinor found herself standing once more in the ballroom where the entire story had first begun, invited alongside Julian to a gathering hosted by Lord Pembroke in celebration of the harvest season. This time, as she entered on her husband's arm, there was no wine stain, no cruel laughter, no whispered mockery following her every step. Instead, she was greeted with warm smiles and genuine respect from a society that had watched her transform, over the course of a single remarkable year, from an overlooked young woman into someone whose quiet strength had earned admiration far more valuable than any title alone could provide. Mrs. Caldwell approached her early in the evening, her weathered face creased with a fond smile. "You have changed this house considerably, my dear," she said, gesturing toward the room around them. "Not simply Ashworth Hall, but this entire ballroom. People speak of kindness now where once they only spoke of status." Elinor smiled warmly at the elderly woman who had, quite unknowingly, played a small but significant role in bringing her and Julian together in the first place. "I have simply tried to remain the same person I always was," Elinor said. "Whatever changed was never truly within me. It was, perhaps, within how others chose to see me. As the evening progressed, Julian found her near the edge of the dance floor, extending his hand with the same quiet confidence he had shown that very first night. "Would you honor me with a dance, Duchess?" Elinor laughed softly at the formal address, still unaccustomed after all these months to the title that now accompanied her name. "Always," she said, taking his hand. As they moved together across the familiar floor, surrounded now by genuine warmth rather than cruel curiosity, Elinor reflected on how remarkably her life had transformed since that first humiliating evening. The wine stain that had once threatened to define her as an object of ridicule had instead become, in hindsight, the opening note of a story far richer and more meaningful than she could ever have imagined for herself. She thought of the frightened young woman who had stood trembling near the ballroom's edge, certain her evening and perhaps her entire future had been ruined beyond repair. That woman had survived humiliation, weathered betrayal, fought for truth against a carefully constructed lie, and ultimately emerged not simply intact, but stronger and more secure in her own worth than she had ever believed possible. "You are thinking rather deeply for the middle of a dance," Julian observed, studying her thoughtful expression with gentle curiosity. "I am simply grateful," Elinor said, meeting his eyes with quiet affection. "For all of it, even the difficult parts. Without them, I do not believe I would understand quite so clearly what I have found in you and in this life we have built together." Julian drew her slightly closer as the music continued around them, his voice low and warm. "I made my choice long before that evening, Elinor, but I confess, watching you weather everything that followed with such grace only confirmed, again and again, that I had chosen well." As the dance concluded and the evening stretched onward into celebration, Elinor understood with complete certainty that whatever future challenges awaited them, she would face them exactly as she had faced everything since that fateful night, with honesty, resilience, and the quiet strength that had, against every expectation society once held for her, ultimately proven to be her greatest asset all along. The wine-stained gown had long since been discarded, but Elinor sometimes thought of it still, tucked away in memory as a strange and unlikely symbol of everything that had followed. What had been intended as an instrument of cruelty had instead become, through circumstances no one could have predicted, the very beginning of a love story built not on status or fortune, but on the simple, enduring truth of who she had always been.